Yeah, we're going to dive right in and kind of intro things. I'm Lacey, and I'll be leading the training today. And a couple of the kind of logistics up at the top. A big thank you to Canada Council for the Arts, whose support is making this workshop series possible. I'm really happy to be working with ACCA in the process of this. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional and stolen territory of the Ganyankahage Moha, a place that has served as a gathering site and exchange site amongst nations for quite a long time. And I know many of you are joining from all over Turtle Island, and I want to take a moment to just really recognize the historical oppression of lands and cultures and the originals people on the land in which we're currently living. And kind of in the context within this series of digital tools and digital trainings, I want to share a couple of things to just kind of keep in your mind around these pieces as we're talking about sort of the digital world. And I'm going to paste a couple of links in the chat box and kind of reference these. Many of you are probably familiar with nativeland.ca. If you're not, it's a great website where you can kind of check out the area that you live in and learn more about the original people who lived and live there and kind of just gain some of that information. And a really interesting article as well that I came across kind of in my learning, and just this idea of, how do we like really integrate this recognition and what this means, and this kind of acknowledgement of what has come before us on the lands that many of us live on, is thinking about like how do we continue to bring awareness of Indigenous culture into even this digital world and these conversations. And the article that I posted in is a really kind of interesting one about Indigenous sovereignty and digital territory, and pulling information about like land-based cyber pedagogy and repatriations of land-based relations in digital environments and digital bridges to homeland and lifeways and settler colonialism in cyberspace, and some just really interesting things that I personally had never thought about at all before I did some of this looking. And so just want to kind of plug some of these pieces as well for just continuing to kind of have awareness in all of the different things that we're doing in everything in our lives. So noting those pieces. Yeah, so I'm happy to be here with all of you, and I see many familiar names and some faces as well. And I'll give kind of my intro spiel. And oh yeah, I want to answer this question. Yes, someone had asked if PDFs or of the talk will be emailed or posted for download. So and I'll let one of the ACCA folks clarify or correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the YouTube links of these trainings will be available on YouTube for I think the month, and then are only available to folks within the network afterwards. And I am happy to share the PowerPoints as well, and I'll let someone else say how those are going to be accessible. Okay, yeah, because you can't post the PDF PowerPoint. So we'll sort that out and follow up on that. But yeah, so quick kind of intro stuff, even though I talked about some of these pieces and I recognize many of who your names and your faces. But in case you haven't been with us previously, quick who I am. I'm a trainer, consultant. I work a lot with nonprofits, arts organizations, corporations. I'm a psychotherapist. I specialize in relational neurosciences and trauma and neurodivergence, and also work in the multidisciplinary arts realm. And I run some specialized arts programming in the circus world and theater world for autistic youth and foster youth, and kind of a little bit of everything. And I wear a lot of different hats. And yeah, so all of these pieces get kind of blended together in the things that I do. And when kind of approaching this series, which if you've been here, you've heard me say, I've talked about how, when we think about kind of digital literacy and what that looks like, that it's important, of course, to be able to operate and navigate the tools that we use. But even beyond that, because the landscape is changing so quickly, that part of what I want to impart throughout this series is really the ways to kind of think critically about how we are engaging with the tools that we're using, how we can learn about learning about the tools and understanding the theory and practices and all of these varying pieces. And so we've kind of started wide and are narrowing in a little bit. And then next week, we will get into some kind of concrete exploration with specifically many different whiteboard tools, but we're going to be even within that looking at okay, how can we think sort of creatively and critically about how we're engaging these tools, in addition to just like, how do you make the line appear and things like this? So those things are on the horizon. And then just plugging to training 5 and 6 are based on the requests that you all give to us. So feel free, write in the chat box, write via private message, whatever, to express your desires there. So feel free anytime. And I'm curious for those of you who have attended previously, if kind of in the conversation that we've been having so far, if there's been specific things that you've kind of taken away or been thinking about or thinking through based on the conversations that we've had so far, I'd love to hear those if there is anything like that, just as we're getting started. I know some of you are here for the first time, which is just fine as well. But if there are any kind of reflections or thoughts, feel free to type them, say them. You're welcome to unmute. Yeah, yeah, we talked a little bit about Chat GPT. Amazed and worried, fair. Yeah, yeah, a lot to unpack there. Totally. Pros and cons. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of this process too, right? Is even when we interact with something and have sometimes kind of the uncertainties or the dualities or the multitudes of like, this is really cool and exciting. And also there are all of these other things. Um, I think it's really good that like, obviously, it would be great if everything wasn't complicated in potentially negative ways, but it's good to be able to think through these pieces of like, oh yeah, what does this mean for me, and how do I feel about this, and what is my personal kind of take or feelings about it mean in the larger world, etc. Yeah, so there's I think so many different pieces. Yeah, cool, totally. Yes, transitioning. Yes, lots of pros and cons. Gym for the brain, for sure. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and feel free. I love. Yeah, you can send me direct messages, things you'd like more. Awesome, cool, awesome, cool. So yeah, thank you for those pieces of feedback, and we'll kind of continue to have as we get more and more kind of into the practice of this. Also, more discussions, maybe in smaller rooms or all together. And I'm glad that some of the bigger pieces and theory parts are landing. And as always, feel free, you can unmute, you can chat, ask questions, etc. Always very, feel free to engage in those ways. You're welcome to be here with that. And yeah, kind of diving into this picture again, a little bit of kind of hitting some of the things we hit last time to grow upon, but we looked at this idea of last week, kind of like, how do we pick the right tool, and what does that mean? And how do we really assess, and what's the process of that? And kind of the way that if we're thinking about implementation, there's all of these phases of like exploring it and sort of making sense of what we learn and repeating this as we need, picking something, planning, implementing all of these. And of course, as I've noted, many of us are using technological tools that we didn't necessarily pick ourselves, but that maybe we uh, have to use within an organization, or we're using maybe lots of tools that we didn't or wouldn't have even picked. And so I want to talk about today kind of this idea of like, how do I leverage and optimize the tools that I am using? And what does that look like, both when it's maybe a tool that I didn't pick or when it is something that I am picking? And we talked about this last time, so I'm going to kind of blow through this quickly, but we looked at this idea of when we're implementing things that we want to be thinking about if you're starting with something new, kind of the standard questions, right? Of knowing who's involved, what does the implementation look like? What are the goals? What are the priorities? How are we going to review this? When are we going to review this? What are the ways we're collecting that data, et cetera? And so all of these things, as we're kind of moving into, okay, something is actually on board now, either that we picked and are implementing, or I've inherited this tool or application from an organization, or maybe I've even am using a tool that like maybe I did pick 2 years ago, that now I would like to change it to something else, but I'm trying to figure out how to do that in a way that kind of makes sense and feels good and is aligned. And so when we think about this, kind of this idea of leveraging digital tools, we're going to look at it today from kind of a little bit of a broad theoretical angle as well, and then get kind of more specific towards the end and in kind of the next week. But overall, I'm thinking about when I think about leveraging tools, intentional selection, if you're selecting it, making sure that we understand the purpose and features of the tool, which seems really basic. But I think, sometimes tools are really complicated or have lots of features that we don't even know about, that then we discover, or we maybe do know a tool really well and then a new feature's added because someone along the way decided that made sense and it probably did. But we may not always know what those things are. And I would say, we've talked about kind of this idea that a lot of the things we do on default, and our brain just is kind of like, yes, this is the way, this is what email is and the role it plays in my life and how we use it and how that goes. And that's not necessarily bad or wrong or anything like that. But sometimes it means that we are kind of replicating patterns and things that maybe aren't actually serving us, that when we evaluate, wait, is this really working for me? How I'm doing this, that we discover new things or different things, or maybe shift the ways we're using things. Um, yeah, so those pieces. Things like also when we're looking at optimizing, leveraging, analyzing our usage, making sure that we're using shortcuts, integrations, hidden tools, that we're getting feedback from people or places that have other information and that we're continuing our learning. And so we're going to kind of go through each of these and look at um, these different pieces and what this actually means. Okay. And then we're going to kind of skip over the intentional selection because we talked about that last week. And if you didn't make that one, go check the YouTube. But then we'll, uh, yes, dive into the other ones. And yes, very much led that comment of very absolutely like we pick the digital tools and then, yeah, drive them without ever really getting that time. And I think this is, I think this exact thing is something that we see in all, depends on your organization and what you're doing and all of that. But in all organizations of every size, the reality, I think, often of like there's often firefighting or just a need to like to go or to do the next thing or to solve the problem or to respond or to meet whatever deadlines it is, that we don't always have the ability to really kind of create that foundation of evaluation and intentional, like, wait a minute, how can I use this best? And am I using it in the way that like I actually want to be using it? And the evidence for me around this is probably the simplest tool that everyone in here uses, which is email, right? And this email is amazing and does so many wonderful things and lets us communicate. And for me, it's a constant kind of battle and struggle to look at like, oh, wait, when am I checking my email? And when is that like actually useful for me versus just pulling my focus and keeping me distracted? And what are the ways that I write my emails? And can I do that more efficiently? And what are the ways that I can navigate more efficiently some of the tasks that previously happened in email, like emailing back and forth to find a schedule time? Can that be on an online calendar? Attaching and having email templates, right? Like these things that it's like we use email all the time. And yet, probably all of us, myself included, still could be using it more efficiently than we are, right? And yeah, so very common challenge for sure. So, understanding purposes and features of the tool. And I kind of talked about this, and we won't go too into depth with this either, because we talked a lot about last week, like how do we get the information about tools that we're considering or that we maybe want to understand more, but always thinking about, I think often about going back to the fundamentals of like, what does this tool offer? And not, I think when I think about this, and I'll come out of screen sharing for a second, I think about kind of the like the marketing adage that is like when you're selling people a shelf, you're not actually just selling them a piece of wood on the wall. You're selling them a thing to store their prized books on, or you're selling them the thing that makes their partner happy because things are organized now, or you're selling them um, like a display case, right? And so it's like, what are the things that are underneath the functions of this, or just the list of, okay, well, this does calendaring. Okay, but what does that offer me in the role that I have? Like for me, doing the work that I do, some of which is traditional therapy work. I see regular old therapy clients, and I also do a lot of different online trainings. And so my schedule is really variable. And so for me, it's like, okay, well, that offers a lot of ease and reduces my emails to have an online scheduling system where folks can just pick a session. It also helps me organize me thinking about like, okay, when do I actually want to make an available spot? Because for me, my schedule is really dynamic. And so there's intentional kind of thought that has to go into that. It can build in for me the rules of someone can't schedule right after someone else. There has to be a 15-minute buffer. So it's also supporting kind of my own well-being and okayness. I could set a limit to how many sessions are booked a day. Right. And so when we think about like what is the feature of this, looking at like what does this mean to me? What is this feature offering me? And what is the like gain or value of that? And is it aligned with how I'm using it right now? Because sometimes even when something offers something great, if you don't set it up in the way that actually serves you, then you may end up having 9 client sessions in a row, which is not a good time, right? So sort of being intentional and thinking through like how are we using the tools? What are the functions of these things? And kind of leading through these pieces. And let me go back at my share screen. Uh, Seeking updates and information on updates and kind of evaluating functionality. And I recommend periodically, and this is kind of the continued learning piece we talked about last week too, but periodically with whatever tools you use, doing a Google or an AI chat GPT that is like asks what are the most recent updates or updated features of insert tool here, because sometimes it's the really little things that can make a huge difference. Like for example, I learned now it's been a good chunk of time, but this feature existed long before I knew it existed. I learned that you could make like tab groups on Google Chrome. Like I don't know if y'all use Google Chrome, but I'm a person who has like tabs on tabs on tabs open all the time, and you can actually group them into a like sub folder tab and click and open and close those. And that's made a huge difference for me in my daily life, even though it's a simple feature but I didn't know it existed, right? So bringing that kind of into your everyday practice. Also, if you want to know how to do that and don't know how to do that, open your Chrome and give it a shot. And if you don't see it, let me know. But you generally just right click on the tab and can add to group and then make a group name. So if you can't find it or need that, again, just let me know. But I love that feature quite a lot. So coming back into share screen. Okay. So diving through a couple more of these things, and then we'll, kind of go from here. So setting goals and expectations like this, obviously, hopefully, we're doing this in the implementation phase, but often, as Lynn noted, it's not actually happening or not as well as we want it to because we're just trying to manage life. And also, technology can be really overwhelming and figuring out okay, what are all these features and how can I implement this? It really is a process, right? And it is that iterative kind of design theory process of exploration, seeing how it goes, making adjustments, trying again, and doing kind of that prototyping model, right? But when either you're starting a tool or even right now, I encourage you all to take kind of a moment and list out, okay, what am I using? What are the tools I'm in? And what are the things that I want to achieve by using this? Which again falls into that category of things that like we of course kind of feel like we cognitively know, right? Where it's like, okay, well, of course I use email to communicate with people. Like that's not rocket science. But if I really think about like, wait, what are the actual kind of goals of this? And it's like, well, I want to be able to effectively and quickly exchange information with potential clients, current clients. I want to be able to communicate about what I do. And when we have those pieces, we start developing kind of the like parameters of how I can evaluate like, is this actually happening or not? What does that look like? Right. And looking at how do I know when I'm meeting this goal and like what are the markers of success with that? And like how am I going to evaluate that? And what are the ways and to like implement some of these pieces? And I recognize that also it's like all of this is kind of this iterative process and this learning and engaged process. And that, if you're like, oh my gosh, sitting down and evaluating deeply everything that I use, like that's too overwhelming. It's fine. Start with a tiny piece, right? Set a 5-minute Friday into the day to say, how did things go this week with email? what worked really well, what didn't work really well. Great. That's enough to start with, right? And knowing that it's like, I think doing this and continuing our relationship with technology is always going to be kind of an ongoing process, especially with it changing, and that it's less about completing the full perfect evaluation and more about just beginning this relationship of exchange and evaluations, right? Um, yes. So thinking about these things, what are the features, functionalities? What are the expectations for how it's going to assist? Some of these kind of extension of things we talked about last week. Again, this analyzing our usage of the tools and really paying attention to how am I using these tools? What am I using them for? Like, how is that working? What is the frequency to which I'm using things? What am I using most and least? And what's that about? Sometimes it's about the fact that I use the most, the thing that is the best help and best tool. And sometimes we're not actually using the tool that maybe would be most useful the most, which we can then look at. If we're using something less, is it because it's actually not helpful, or are we perhaps not utilizing it to its full potential that's there? Right. So, kind of evaluating like, how are the tools that you use serving you or not serving you? And we're going to talk a little bit about this, and then we'll have a breakout room conversation kind of about this. But I'm going to give you a couple more nuggets to think about. Evaluating the time that you spend on things. Are there tools that are taking up tons of your time? And what is that about also? Like looking at when I'm doing whatever function it is in this tool, is that going well and easily? And if not, why? Perhaps it's just a laborious, clumsy task that is just kind of hard to do. And that may just be what it is. But also asking that question of, oh, yeah, is there something else I could do to make this work better? Are there shortcuts? Are there integrations? Are there other things that might shift or change these pieces, right? Reflecting on, why are we using this tool? If we did decide to use it, why? If I'm given this tool from an external source, why do they use it? Like, what's your understanding of that? And also ensuring that your understanding of the use of that tool does align with the organization, because often it's like everyone's kind of in that place of like, oh yeah, we use Slack to communicate. Like, of course we do. We know what this is. And that's true. But if we really stop and have a conversation that's like, okay, I'm understanding that you all implemented this because you want to be able to more easily message each other or share documents or whatever. Is that actually why it was implemented? And how is everyone feeling that is going? Or are there different ways that um, we could use that differently? And I think a lot of times, the same way that just regular communication conversations don't happen in organizations as much as they could or should be happening, in terms of even just having the conversation with the colleague about, hey, how's our working relationship going? Is there anything that uh, you would like differently from me, or things that are working really well in our exchange of information, or things that maybe feel like they're challenging, that we could sort through how to navigate that better? We often just don't have those conversations. And sometimes we do, which is great, but often it's not happening. And I'd argue that these should be happening in general a lot more, but that technology is part of this, because often it is just the like modality and method of the communication, but still very much is this extension of communication and what that looks like. Okay. So thinking about like, I kind of talked about these pieces, like what are the features that I'm using, not using in this idea of analyzing, identifying the pain points with tools. And I mentioned this a little bit already, but looking at like, are there ways that those can be changed? Is something loading slowly? Is there a reoccurrent issue or problem or confusion? Are people, sitting in a meeting and saying, yes, let's use it this way, and then that's not actually happening outside of it? And what is that about, right? And how do we move through that? Okay. And oh yeah, we'll come back to this in a second. So what I want to do is give you a moment, and this will be a very short conversation. I'm going to make breakout rooms, and you'll be in the rooms with 3 to 4 other folks. And you'll just, say hello, say who you are. And I want to just give you a moment kind of amongst yourselves to reflect on whatever this brings up for you and these ideas of kind of analyzing and thinking about usage and the things that kind of come to mind or that you wonder about or like maybe are noticing or wanting to bring or kind of awareness or curiosity to and just kind of have a moment of conversation and engagement and reflection together about that. I'll pull you back in just a couple of minutes. This will be like a 4 to 5 minute conversation. This will be quick, and we will see you all soon. See you momentarily. Welcome back. Cool. I know it was a quick conversation. I see folks still trickling in. Sometimes Zoom has the moment of lag load back in. Yeah, I know it was a quick time, but I'm curious. Yeah, did similar reflections show up for folks in the rooms? Yeah, thoughts, reflections.
Hi, it's Kathleen. One thing we talked about in our room was how different systems are not compatible for everyone, and that thinking about how that works is very important.
Yeah, totally. And tell me, when you say compatible, do you mean just like even operating system kinds of
Operating
things?
systems and ways of interacting with whatever the platform is that come from different, places of either more, less, or you need
Yes.
more, you need less. Anyway, that was an interesting.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for that reflection. Yeah. And I think this, it makes me think about too, like the even just it's like there's the technological knowledge variance. There's also just like, okay, yeah, what device does someone use and what does that look like? There also may be different adaptive needs or tools that do or don't have varying options. And I think it makes me think about too the reality that even if all of the technology in the world suddenly vanished or didn't exist, I mean, obviously, if it all vanished, we'd have a lot of other things to navigate, but that even without technology in this space, inherently the ways that you and I or whoever ideally work, ideally share information, ideally exchange things, the ways maybe that we communicate are not always going to align. And sometimes I think technology can either help close that gap or sometimes make it more challenging, depending. Yeah, thanks for that reflection. Yeah, any other thoughts come up?
And some of us vented
Uh-huh.
about how we get forced into using systems like we were talking about Teams and why so many institutions use Teams, and that this is, Microsoft plot to make sure they sell their products, and I'm sure it is. And now, I also hate but browsers, you have to have Google Chrome to do certain things. You can't, I like to use Firefox so that I am not beholden to one of these giants that are controlling our lives. But I have colleagues who work in the Google suite and the Microsoft Teams suite, and so we are forced to learn to use these. And I just go offline and vent for a little while, and then I try to learn how to use it because
Totally.
in consulting, we're all working with others. That's what it's about.
Totally.
Just some venting went on.
No, but for sure. I mean, I think I saw lots of like very relatable head nods and yeah, like, I mean, I think there is technology is amazing in a lot of ways. And also there is this very real sort of like additional strange cost when there has to be the like, okay, I'm using this one and that requires the Firefox. And then I also have to have the Chrome for the whatever. And then there's like the sort of puzzling of that really, yeah, is challenging for sure. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Any other thoughts, reflections come up? Oh, that's cool. Maurizio, Brave is an independent Chrome compatible browser, secure and privacy centric. Awesome. I have not heard of Brave. Very cool. That's great to check out. Yeah. And if y'all have things that you love or tools or whatever that feel free to throw those in the chat box because I think we all are always kind of looking for these additional pieces. So do feel free to suggest those things because that is very useful. Nice. Yeah. Awesome. I'll keep moving a little bit, but feel free, thoughts, reflections, keep them coming. Um, yeah. So there's so many directions and pieces. So I'm also kind of reorganizing myself. Um, you've probably heard of sunk cost fallacy terminology, but maybe you haven't. And oh, let me hold on. I'm going to pause myself because I saw a couple new chats go through. Yeah, totally. The will and the time to do tech audits. Definitely. And it's this challenging piece, right? Of like, realistically, even if I paused all of my like work, like actual work, like job doing, and just was like, I'm gonna do a life audit and like break down and look at everything, like we still would not be able to do all of that successfully to where we're like, okay, good. I feel like I have the perfect plan in place. Because it's sometimes hard to know what the perfect plan is until we are sort of in it and adapting and engaging. And then it's like, who has that time or ability to stop everything and create the full plan? And so I think when I think about this, because I also live this, right? It's like I will be the first to tell you that I'm talking about all of these things. And am I perfect at doing all of this? Absolutely not. Like I use and don't use the technology that I use very perfectly and imperfectly, kind of depending on the situation. And I also could really stand to um, look at these pieces. And I also live the life of like, I've got a Google Drive that is amazing in so many ways and is a great organizing tool for me. And also that there are a bunch of documents and old systems that were started at one point because I thought it was the thing that made sense that I don't look at or reference and that I know are there and need to be sorted through, but I don't have the time. And often the the sense can be with these things of like, okay, well, of course, I'm going to prioritize my time into the thing that like is actually deadlined or urgent. And so, combing old Google Docs is like not really that high on the list. Um, but I think looking at for these kinds of things, like, okay, is something a like combing old Google Docs, which is maybe not high on the list, or is it a like, okay, if I really do take 3 hours to look at how I'm using whatever this main tool is that we use, like, can I actually potentially come out of that in a way that does maybe even give me those 3 hours back and more because of what I've come to understand. Right. And it's all sort of a variable piece. And I think to me, that's part of the the process of like just bringing these things to our thought where it's like I've personally accepted for myself because of how I know myself and the way that I manage my time and my work and all of these pieces that it's like always going to have an aspirational component to it of like I will never likely do the full degree to which I wish I did these things, but I've accepted that reality as part of my process, right? That I'm like, okay, I want to understand the full list of things I could do that maybe would be helpful. And also recognize that I'm not going to be able to do this to the extent that maybe I would potentially like to, but that even if I'm just bringing slightly more awareness to it, uh, on a daily basis or even weekly basis or even once a month or whenever it happens to pop into my mind and I'm making slow progressive shifts or improvements or levels of awareness, then that is better than the alternative, right? So yeah, very much those pieces and thinking through that. Yeah, and these other ones, yes, very little onboarding goes into that and the frustration. Totally. And I think sometimes I think onboarding in lots of domains can be less than. And then I think sometimes it's like that, oh, we all just know what this is for. So we're just going to be like, well, you know how to use the features, right? So now we're just using it. But that doesn't mean that we're using it effectively, right? Like the Google Doc and Drive situation that's like, kind of basic in the world of like technological tools when we're talking about like full apps and tools. Like, but I've created so many systems in there or started the document or started the whatever that, I'm certainly using the tool. I very well know how to navigate and use Google Drive. But are my systems set up as well as they could be when I start a shared folder with someone else? How often do we actually have a conversation about like, oh yeah, do we want to make this shared folder? And how does that work? And what is our function of this? And like, how do we want to add new documents and organize within it? And sometimes it's okay to not have these conversations about everything, but also it can mean that I've got a billion shared folders that are half used, half not used, no real system, etc. Right? So thinking kind of through these pieces of like, oh yeah, we know how to use this, even if we know like the, nitty gritty of like operating it. Are we having the conversations internally, even sometimes with ourselves or with other people that let it be most effective? Um, yeah. And yes, very much the finding the right tools according to the size of the organization and the product and what that project and what that is and looks like. Totally. Um, yes. Thank you for those thoughts. And yeah, so I think about like this kind of idea of sunk cost fallacy, which many of you are probably familiar with, but in case you're not, it's essentially the cognitive bias in which we're investing or continuing to kind of invest time, money, resources, whatever, into something based on the amount of investment we've already made into it rather than the expected future outcome. And so this is what happens often when, if we maybe started using a tool or an organization started using a tool and is, it's not working that well, or it's not super effective, or there would maybe be a different or better tool. But the prevailing thing that keeps the usage of the tool going is this sense of like, well, we've already like instituted this and we've already like put this energy into making this happen. And so we're going to stick with it. When really we need to be looking at what is the future likelihood that this is going to do the thing that we need or want it to do? And what is the actual process? What's needed to close that gap from where we are right now versus that potential hopeful future? And what needs to happen between those? And are we actually going to do it? And do we actually have the capacity to do it? Right. And so just wanting to kind of continually evaluate that for ourselves. Uh, Yes. So very much all of these pieces, definitely. Cool. So a couple of other things. I know that we started talking kind of about some of the AI stuff last week. And something that I just kind of want to note also in this process of using tools and exploring tools, we looked at like, okay, how can I just use tools to gain the information about using something or to sort of check against how am I using this versus what are the ways that I could be using this? Or for example, these ideas of looking for shortcuts in integrations, so looking for like, okay, within this is just a chat GPT question of, asking what are different shortcuts in Asana and finding these different keyboard shortcuts, right? And okay, that might or might not be useful. Like, how can I get that, information easily? Looking up hidden tools, right? So are there hidden tools within insert whatever you use here? And figuring out what else is available, is possible. And kind of like we talked about last week, this idea of, even if you're not able to like complete the full kind of audit of like, okay, this is how I'm using it. This is what the problem is. Now I'll research the problem. That even if you're doing kind of the window shopping exploration like this of looking up, oh yeah, what are the hidden tools? What are the less common ways people are using this? What are the keyboard shortcuts that even if you're reading this on a metro or on a bus or for 5 minutes, that it just kind of keeps this in your brain fresh, right? So it just kind of keeps these things happening and unfolding. And I'm just, yes, totally, very much these, yes, comments, absolutely. Um, yeah. So I think thinking through this continuation of like when I'm thinking about leveraging digital tools, how can I also use AI within that to get information about what other options might be available? Looking at what are the integration options between the things that you're using, Trello, Salesforce, Gmail, etc. And just seeing what that is, right? Of like, how can I make my workflow more efficient, whether or not you're looking to solve a specific problem or you're just wanting to learn in general. Um, I'll also note within this something that is like kind of added tricky about this that many of you probably experience, depending on what kind of consulting you're doing and what your exact work is. But I've definitely done work where it's like two different organizations that use Slack and use maybe even some of the same tools, but that I can't integrate it personally as much as I would want to because there's these kind of crossovers and different things being used in different ways. And yeah, that can just be an added layer of challenge. So yeah, things to think about. Something else that I'll kind of note within this sort of bigger picture of looking at technology holistically and not just like, okay, what is the feature of this and what feature should I be using? But to me, a lot of it comes back kind of because of kind of my own interpersonal neurobiology focus and therapy focus, these ideas of understanding our own kind of ideal working styles and like what are our tendencies in general? What are the things that we prefer? What are the challenges that we face when we are kind of doing anything? And so, just to kind of like reflect on a couple of these things and just sort of throw out other sort of tools or things that may kind of pique curiosity or interest, um, especially when thinking about these. And I'm going to share my internet screen. Give me just a second. Coming in on a different window. Okay. So, a couple of things that, for example, are interesting. This is one that I just found this week that I think is really kind of cool in a lot of different ways that it breaks things down so you don't have to. And you can choose the level of like, how much breaking down do I want for this? And it can be things like, work stuff of like, okay, implement Slack at work is my big category. And then when you press the little magic wand next to it, it breaks down all of these kind of sub parts of this. And then if you're like, oh, I need to know how to open the Slack admin console, like what does that actually mean? I can click that and it will expand out what that is. Right. And so just these ways that, well, it's kind of going really slowly right now, but oh yeah, there we go. But it like will literally walk you through exactly like, how do you do that? What does that look like? Right. And you can also do this for like, regular life tasks of like clean the bathroom, and it's going to give you the broken down pieces. And the reason that I mention this is twofold. One is that this is really can be overwhelming to think about like, okay, what would it actually mean to do sort of an audit on these things? And that some of that process can be sort of offloaded to an external AI source of like, okay, break down even what that would mean or look like to do. But also because I think that this speaks to this reality of like, if I know for me, and this is kind of true for me, that it's like, if there is a task that I have to do, like, it's like, okay, I have to make this 15-minute phone call to somewhere. I don't really mind talking on the phone, but because that means I'm going to then have to look up the number and then do the call and then open the tab of the whatever I need to reference while I do it, my personal brain just is more inclined to kick that down the road and to not do that as much, right? And so I know for me that it's like, okay, if I pull that phone number and put it on my calendar event and link the document that I'm going to reference directly, then that means I'm more likely to do it, right? And so I know that about myself, so I can customize how I'm using the things that I'm using the same way that these tools can be both resources and kind of helpful things. And there really are just like AI tools for everything. Some of the other neat things within this, there's a formalizer. You can turn your text spicy to not spicy. You can get a read on, am I misreading the tone of this? An estimation on the time something takes. You can even kind of brain dump and it'll make you a list of tasks, right? So there's all sorts of things like this that exist and can be interesting to check out. There's massive lists of all sorts of different AIs that exist that can just be interesting to think about. So I just encourage you, like in this process, to even be like, as you're just living your normal life of like, what could I do differently in life? Or where am I sort of growing? Or the things that we're implementing professionally or whatever, just taking the moment to do take the Google of, hey, is there an AI for that? Like, what are people doing in this domain? What are the developments happening in these areas to just sort of keep some of this going and ongoing? Yeah. Um, yeah. So there's lots of pieces there. I saw another tool the other day, Grantable, .co. I think that you can like input old grant materials and it will like make it a lot easier to sort of generate new grant materials. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are kind of unfolding in this domain that I think are really, really kind of neat and exciting. And so, yeah, so just kind of in continuing the exploration. And the one last thing we'll sort of hit today, kind of information download wise, and then next week we'll do even more sort of engagement conversation, is looking at something else to kind of think about where you may be able to implement automations in the work that you're doing. And if you're using automations of some kinds, I'd love for you to type those in the chat just because it's great for other people to sort of see where are you using those and what does that look like. And we'll talk about different types of this in a moment. But if you're using automations, feel free to share those because it's great to know. But when we're thinking about this, there are a lot of tools that can really kind of offload work that we're doing or just simplify things, right? And so identifying what are things that I'm doing regularly, whatever it is. Is it responding to emails, entering data, tracking data, scheduling meetings, like whatever it is that's happening a lot, and looking at how are we currently doing those things and how is that going? And just doing that kind of learning about what other options and tools are there potentially. Sometimes it might be simple things of like an email template or filters for common inquiries. Maybe it's having a scheduling tool or something else. But there's all sorts of tools that do integrations. These are just 4 of them that I picked kind of randomly. All of the tools that I reference are not inherently like the best tools that there are or the top picks or anything, but just kind of pulling from things that are out there. But there's so many different things that we can do to automate things, depending, of course, like what is the nature of your actual work and what are you actually doing. But for example, we can create automations that add email attachments to Dropbox without us having to manually do that. We can create new Trello cards if you use Trello from Gmail emails. We can send Slack messages when Twitter mentions are received, send notifications to Slack channels when calendar events are added. Save Eventbrite attendees automatically to MailChimp, so we don't have to do that kind of on purpose. We can create Asana tasks from Google Sheets rows, right? Like there's so many different things depending on what you're using that can potentially be automated, right? Depending on what you're doing. So I pulled just a couple of data automations, for example, of, you can create a new Salesforce lead when you add a row in a Google Sheets document. So if that's something that you're doing manually, you're having to toggle between different places where you're inputting information, it may be worth looking at like, oh yeah, are there automations for this? Because there often can be lots of different things that can simplify life, right? We can set up automatic reports of completed tasks to email to someone or ourselves sometimes, even if we're doing some kind of like weekly review of, oh yeah, what did I do? I want to take a moment to really acknowledge and recognize I did do a lot this week. And this is what that means and what that information that gives me. Generating budget reports and sending it automatically to someone, right? Like there's all of these different ways that we can create automations. And I'm curious, is anybody using automations in here of varying kinds? Yeah, same. I have done that same thing. And yes, it's so nice to have those things happening automatically. Yeah, Maurizio's using AppleScript. I'm not even that familiar with AppleScript, so I will have to learn about that. Yeah. Oh, and Victoria, this is such a good question. And this is kind of, it falls into that category of, me too, of this reality of, oh, cool, Marion, that's great. Um, of, yeah, that struggle of like, okay, I know that there are ways this could be more efficient, but like, how do I even sort out what that is and what the possibilities are? And yeah, I'll make a note too. I mean, that's a great reference from Marion, because I think that there are people who do that potentially, who do kind of just the, audits or consultants on like, okay, what is happening? And I know how to operate or what the possibilities are. And so let me come in and do kind of that assessment and also implementation, because I do really get that even within MailChimp, which I can use successfully and easily in a lot of ways, but sometimes if you go into, you're creating an automation even within there and you run into a roadblock of like, okay, wait, this isn't working quite right. And why is that? That when that is hard to problem solve, which for me that sometimes can be, that it is really difficult to like get that going and to keep the momentum and to be able to do all of those things and kind of get them in place. And so I think it is a really reasonable and good option potentially to have someone that is like, I can come in as the external expert and set all of these things up without having to engage in the learning process. Maybe there are experts in whatever the things are. Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. Yes, so I will put that on my list as well. And I think it really speaks to me too, to the like the conundrum of like leaning into what does work for us and knowing where that line is between like I'm okay with my system, even if others might think that it is perhaps a bit of a Luddite system in certain ways, versus the place of, okay, I am doing something that is repetitive and taking lots of time that I would get a lot back if someone else could potentially just set this up externally. Yeah, so I think there's some interesting stuff there. And we'll definitely talk more about that. I noticed our time has slipped by. We I've noted several of the questions that you all have. If before you, I mean, log off, of course, if you need to, but if you have things that you're like, I'd love for you to make sure to cover this in the fifth and sixth ones, feel free to throw those out because those are very much kind of unfolding and being created as we go. And then next week, we're going to look at kind of creative usage within the tools that we're using, especially kind of moving between different whiteboard platforms and kind of having some fun and engagement through that as we kind of learn and engage with it. So definitely would love to see you all back then. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, morning, whatever time zone you are in. And I hope to see you all soon. See you again. Thanks, everyone.